Well, it's good to be back. I was away for a few weeks in the blue-green hills of New England, encountering mountaintops in Vermont and fresh ponds, and sitting in on my family's porch watching the creek go by and experiencing the depth of what it means to remember that we are creatures on the planet, something that is lost in our twittering, in our high pressure day to day, in our driving our children back and forth down the roads. I preached last week in Concord, Massachusetts at the old China Cabinet of Our Faith, a church's beautiful place, the home at one time of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, as they'll tell you. It's Thoreau, not Thoreau. Thoreau, they remind you. I managed to preach a sermon without mentioning Waldo Emerson or Thoreau, where the Alcott family and all those famous families of New England gathered on Sunday, and they send greetings to you. My journey began at 4:30 in the morning in a taxi going to the airport. And I've been thinking about that taxi ride all the way to this moment because it was unique. You see, I don't know if really any of you have seen me at 4:30 in the morning, but before at least 3 cups of strong English tea, I'm not much for conversation or engagement. Now, my wife, on the other hand, is an extreme extrovert, and she will talk to anybody at any time in any situation. And so we got into a taxi in the dark of night at 4:30, loaded our stuff in, and started heading to the airport. At which time, my wife and the taxi driver, who's maybe been up all night, start talking. It comes to a conversation about the temperature for some reason, and then to a conversation about global warming or global climate change. The taxi driver creates a conversation around his theory that there is no global climate change. There is only a universe in which every planet is getting warmer, removing entirely the human responsibility from global climate change. Now, I was listening to this, and I listened to his theory, at which point the uncaffeinated fog started to lift from my very being, and I launched into a long sermon about the human impact on the earth, having been in places where chemicals flowed into the ocean and into the rivers and seen the impact of human life. Now, this drive was really only from East Dallas to Love Field, so it wasn't that long a sermon. And I stopped short of going too far with this man who had been, I think, listening to a lot of talk radio, and said to him, even if your theory is correct, it is not either or thinking that will save us. It is not that we have no responsibility to the earth. And even furthermore, separating ourselves from each other and the planet is the greatest evil we can promote in the world. End of sermon. I got out of the taxi and went into the airport. I have no idea how that taxi driver responded. I talk to you about this moment because today we encounter Joanna Macy, who is an environmentalist and activist, in our Faith and Being series, which ends next week, our summer series that looks at interviews between spiritual leaders and Krista Tippet on the On Being podcast. Joanna Macy is our target. The title of her interview with Krista Tippet is A Wild Love for the World. Joanna says in this interview, "My world itself is sacred." I learned this from her in a small class called Spiritual Ground for World Engagement in 1994 in Berkeley, California. I was in seminary. She was my professor. She asked us to journal, to answer the question of how our worlds are sacred. I wrote in mine, and I found my notes. Believe me, reading your journals from 20 years ago takes courage. And I wrote, I try not to compare time to accomplishment or time running out. Perhaps we should do as many people who I met in South Asia do, wear watches that don't work. The city surrounds us with clocks, never in a hurry. Can we live presently in order to live fully? I wrote, I can climb the tallest pine, speaking of a tree that is near my family's place in New England. I can climb the tallest pine because I know where it is, up into the crow's nest, so high above all the other trees I can't see the forest floor. My mind becomes the sky. Lakes nestle into the curves between the hills. Sometimes they sit down like cups and saucers. I can dive into these ponds from here. Under the water, the brown, green, unspoiled water, I can swoop with hawks and perch with chickadees. She asked, "How is your world sacred?" My world itself is sacred, she taught us. Note the wording in that sentence. It's not our world is sacred. It's my world is sacred. It makes it personal, not our world. It is true that our world is sacred, but if you ask it in terms of how your world is sacred, you can't pass the responsibility down the row of taking care of it. My world, this one, the one we taste, the one we breathe, the one we touch every day. Joanna says the world is sacred in our putting food into our mouth, like the food we ate this morning that we hardly remember eating. Knowing the food came from somewhere in the earth. Like the path we walk to come into this room, that sacred place, steps that we barely noticed. Like sitting in these pews hewn out of trees that we do not know where they came from. My world is sacred, she asks. How so? And in her teaching, in her environmentalism, she says, of course, the world is also in trouble. She is now 80. She has seen us move from the nuclear spills all the way to global climate change. And she says our difficulty in looking at what we are doing to our world stems not from a callous indifference or ignorance so much as it stems from our fear and pain at looking carefully at the sacredness of it. Things don't change if we refuse to look at them. This is the core of our grief work, by the way, the work we do in this church with people who come to us who are in grief. We point to both the joys of the world and the difficulties of the world, be they personal or global. And while most religious people would care to ignore the difficulties and just point to the joys, we say this is our faith. to live in the gap between idealism and realism, to live between that which is true, which is what we encounter, and that which is what we hope for. And to know that there is the sacred in that. I saw a friend this vacation, a friend I see every 4 or 5 years, who is my oldest friend. We met when we were 3 years old. We are now 47 and 48. We have lived maybe half our lives. We are essentially the same. We talk to each other the same as when we were children. Yet experience has taught us much. And while we were at his family's place in the northeast corner of Vermont, a short walk to New Hampshire and to Canada, you could do that loop in one day from his place, just to give you an idea of how far we were. We talked about the sacred while we picked wild blueberries. I asked him, as he said, "I have God in my life now," I said, "Talk to me about this God." He said, "My God is ever-present, loving, and my God has many names. I have God in my life, and I am alive," he said, "with joy." We admitted to one another that one or the other of us could have not been alive in that moment through our bad decisions and many circumstances, and that's not an exaggeration. That with all that was going on in our lives, our struggles or the pains, that we could stand at the edge of a lake with our beautiful children in the world and our families and our friends and the sky above us and name God in a humble and holy way, a joy that fills us. The view of the world sacred. To face the struggle and the joy. Joanna Macy says, to face the pain of our world is to pass through to the love of our world. Our absolutely inseparable connectedness with all life points to the sacred. In that moment, the lake and the loon preening on the rock and the berries in our mouths and the stains on our fingers and the feeling of the embrace of an old friend, a smile, a struggle, a love for the world meant there was sacred, that there was God in that place. Joanna Macy asks us whether we will succumb to fear or pain. She asks us if we will pave over our fears, if we will shut down in apathy and let denial set in or cease to run from the outrage and fear. She asks us if we will busy ourselves so much that we will not see the sacred in all our twittering, in all our driving here and there, in all our distractions. The biggest gift, Macy says in this interview, the biggest gift you can give is to be absolutely present. And when you're worrying about whether you're hopeful or hopeless or pessimistic or optimistic, who cares? The main thing is that you're showing up, that you're here, and that you're finding ever more capacity to love this world, because it will not be healed without that. There is a great turning, she says, a turning toward a life that is engaged with the earth, of paying attention to what we put in our mouths, of paying attention to how we pass through the world. And she says there is also a great unraveling, the pressure of the destruction caused by the industrial growth society. And the great moment that we are in is that we do not know which is going to win out. But we have a choice. We have a choice to see our connectedness, to see the world as sacred, or to twitter away the hours of our lives. And I'm not picking on Twitter when I say that. I tweet. But to pay attention to things that matter not. We used to do something in Joanna Macy's class that always seemed very corny to me. But hearing her say it again, I realized again and again what she wanted us to do. We used to sit on the floor of the chapel in seminary in Berkeley. This was the early 90s. It was Berkeley, I don't know. We sat on the floor. She said, "Look at your hand. See in it the hand of ages, linked to those hands that learn to push up from the dry land, to weave, to pluck, to plant. Every particle, every atom in this hand goes back to the beginning of space-time. We are part of that story," she used to say. Ultimately, what is the spiritual connectedness that we can cultivate with ourselves, with the world, with God? That is the question I ask you. That is the question that will last a lifetime to answer and hold us accountable, not just to developing a strong sense of ourselves, but a stronger tie to bigger things, to the world we live in, to the movements of the world that we live in. One of the last entries that I wrote in Joanna's class went like this: "Our solidarity of community is what will pull us through hard times. Our spiritual bondedness is where we will find the strength to survive and not massacre each other." I could add to love the world, to see it is sacred. So your homework this week. I know you love when I say that. Your homework this week is to love the world. To find some silence in your week, to notice the deep confidence offered by your silent vitality, as the poet wrote today. Once today or tomorrow, or at least this week, to notice how you are part of a living planet, part of God's love, part of something vast, part of a long line of history. Your homework is to love the world and to tell someone, how is your world sacred? How do you love it? Even when it's 109 degrees, it doesn't matter. Look at your hand. Look at the hands of those around you. Look at this pew, at the path you walk, at the food you eat. We are the earth. We are the future. The great sunrise red above the broad plains of eternity, said Rilke. And for that, we must be grateful. This is not Earth Day, and there is no great justice in this sermon. There is only the call to know that what we have is sacred and to act on it, to live each step and each day as if God walks with us through the sacred paths, the sacred things of the earth that turn and sound and touch and hold us. And that's all I have to say on my first day back from vacation. Amen.